an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future.
You know, the more we talk about the urgency to deal with the climate crisis, the more we explore this existential threat that we're all facing, the more I start to hear the cash register ringing. Tackling emissions, hitting net zero goals by the end of this decade is this overstating it? I don't think so. It's almost going to need an industrial revolution 2.0.
Ooh. And it's going to need that political courage to make that happen. It's going to require innovation.
Which means it's going to need money. And I worry that the price tag, the whole how are we going to pay for this narrative is going to slow things down. And that's not what we need when the need is so urgent.
All right, so you're the communications business strategist. What do we do?
Well,
no pressure.
First, I am very glad that you led with communications, because we do have to understand that, especially with all of this, that words do matter. We're seeing that bear out throughout this entire series, right? Remember back to the kitchen table roundtable we had, where our mom and dad panel misunderstood the very definition of clear cutting. So they were equating it to deforestation, which we have learned that it is not. Clear cutting is part of a forest management strategy. It's a tool that helps to make our forests more resilient.
Yeah, as opposed to deforestation, which would be like, when you pave paradise and put up a parking lot.
With a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hotspot.
Yes, gotta love Joni Mitchell. But as I listen to that, she's had the same kind of cultural effect on perceptions of preserving nature that Dr. Seuss's Lorax has had.
I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees.
Okay, but she has a better voice, dulcet tones.
Well, yeah, she plays a pretty good guitar. And can I just point out, Joni plays what looks like a D28 Martin guitar there.
Okay, but stop you right there.
No beautiful wood product, right?
Stop.
And it continues to store carbon.
Okay.
Guitars can save the world.
Uh-huh. Only if that wood comes from a sustainably managed forest, though, which pretty sure it did.
Right. It's not from a forest that was cut down to, build a parking lot.
Joni is describing deforestation. You cut down the trees and change the use of that land. That is different from clear cutting.
And it's an important difference.
So back to your question, how do we deal with the cost of fighting climate change? So first of all, words matter. The language we use in our planning is critical.
Okay, I'm with you.
So the second thing I'd do is shift the focus and language from how are we ever going to pay for this to here are the economic benefits and the bottom line ROI we realize by hitting these net zero goals.
Okay, I'm really glad you said that, because I think we're on the right track here. think you're going to get a kick out of this episode. Not only will we reinforce the notion that Canadian forestry has a role to play in the fight against climate change, we're going to explore the critical role the forestry sector will play as we transition out of a fossil fuel-driven economy. So words matter. Have you heard the word bioeconomy?
Yes.
All right, you care to take a stab at definition?
All right, I'd say, bioeconomy, umbrella term for the economic sector driven by natural or nature-based products.
Yeah, okay. Pretty good stab.
Technically, you could say that the bioeconomy is anything that uses any bio-based material. So that would be any agricultural product, anything that comes from a forest.
Our federal government would consider it to be the sector driven by any product that comes from the forest.
Okay, so that's not quite as broad as my definition. So who's telling you that?
Monique Frison.
My name is Monique Frison, and I am a Director General in the Canadian Forest Service at Natural Resources Canada.
Monique and her team at Natural Resources Canada spends a lot of time not just clarifying the bioeconomy.
I talk about the bioeconomy, or when many of my colleagues talk about the bioeconomy, what we're talking about is using those materials, those bio-based materials, in new and different ways, including as substitutes for materials that have a fossil fuel base or a non-renewable material base.
They're exploring some pretty cool ways to grow the bioeconomy by using those forest and wood products in a new and different way.
How many times have we heard that in this series? Like, what's old is new again. Whether it's recognizing the importance of integrating Indigenous cultural practices into 21st century forest management, we talked about that in the last episode, in fact, or the shift by architects and developers to using more wood in the design and construction of new buildings, the old wisdom, the old product being used in new, different ways. That new building down on the waterfront, George Brown College in Toronto, a mass timber structure. It's poetically home to an innovation hub in Toronto.
Yeah, funny. I brought that up with Monique when I was talking to her. And whenever I tell people, we're building these large urban infrastructure buildings out of wood, the first reaction is, well, that's cool. And immediately, and you had the same reaction. The second reaction is that safe? Aren't we waiting for a fire to happen?
So the way that we get around that is by testing, by working with the National Research Council and with others to conduct large-scale tests. So, for example, this last fall in 2022, we had a test of a building made with mass timber products that we set on fire.
Wait. So they test the wooden building by actually setting it on fire?
Yep. They set it on fire on purpose.
Yes, we set on fire on purpose.
Okay.
We saw how the fire behaved in the building, how long it took to go out, and whether or not it would go out. And indeed it did.
So you're telling me when you did this test that essentially the structure remained intact despite the fire?
The structure remained fully intact.
Wow. So they didn't fight the fire in that case. They didn't hose it down. They let the fire burn itself out, and the frame remained intact. All the furniture was lost, but the structure remained. And this test fire would be done with government authorities that are now setting new building codes.
My understanding is that it's pretty typical to do large-scale tests when you're trying to establish new building codes.
Right, okay.
To provide the evidence that building code setters would need in order to determine if they could add more stories to a wood building.
We've already talked about the ROI of using this mass timber in construction. You'll remember Nick Milestone.
I'm the Director of Sales, Marketing and Project Execution for Mercer Mass Timber, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Mercer International.
His mic drop moment, you'll recall in episode 6, came when he told us how much his team saved by building with mass timber.
We reduced the construction schedule by 20%, and that effectively reduced the construction cost by 11% because the whole thing was just quicker.
They reduced the build time by 20% and then the costs by another 11%. They saved both time and money, mostly because the mass timber is manufactured to the design specs of an off-site factory.
Yeah, he actually described it more like a build kit. So not only does that speed things up on the construction site, it also makes the site a safer workplace.
Where we're doing more and more off-site to reduce the construction labour on-site, it's a safer environment to be on a construction site now. You know, the more labour on a construction site, that has a high probability of health and safety incidents, especially when building at heights.
So we need to follow up on that. We should see if we can put a dollar figure on the insurance savings. If the mass construction site is a safer site, it means fewer workplace injuries, fewer hospital or rehab visits. So you really have to begin to think that that translates into cost savings on things like insurance premiums as well. Also means higher productivity. Add to that the resilience of the mass timber against this threat of fire, and insurance, the costs and the pressures on resources of municipal fire departments. All of these things are beneficial.
Okay, so let's take it a step further. What happens if we build hospitals and fire halls with mass timber? That ripple effect on ROI is kind of mind-blowing.
It is, but that downstream effect, that benefit, can't be enough to drive the bioeconomy, can it?
Well, you would be correct.
One of the advantages of the bioeconomy and developing it is not only figuring out the innovative uses for wood fiber, it's also to figure out how to increase circularity and increase the number of times we're using those products, so that in the end, the demand and the pressure on taking new resources from the planet is reduced.
Monique will tell you the strength of the bioeconomy can't simply rely on the development of new product like mass timber. It comes down to a narrative we've heard again before in this series, and that is making the most of the wood product.
Sure, we're back to the indigenous practices that insist that we make use of the entire tree. So pulp, paper, lumber, all those things that come to mind, right? Mass timber uses wood product that would otherwise go to waste.
And that probably meant burning it to dispose of it in days gone by.
Certainly in the past, but what we've seen over the last couple of decades is that the industry has been looking for ways to use those, what they call residuals, and the tops and the branches. So the wood pellet industry in Canada, for example, has used now a lot of those residuals. You'll see pulp and paper mills who are using lower grade wood as energy resource for the mill. You will see that there are other companies who are trying to find ways to use that material, so they're using more of what they take out.
So the question remains, what are we doing to make the most of the wood product?
Well, 3 R's, right? Reusing, recycling, repurpose. That includes the waste or the wood residuals, they call them, to heat and power the pulp and paper mills or the materials that come from a demolition site.
When we deconstruct a house, that material could be used again. Not necessarily as housing material, but it could be used for other things. The two main components of wood are lignin and cellulose. Lignin can be added to asphalt. Cellulose can be added as microbeads to personal use and cosmetic products. Wood fiber can be used to make clothing. And right now in Canada, you have cars that have the felt on the trunk of hatchbacks, for instance, that can contain and does contain in some instances wood fiber.
And all this new technology and the innovation and the new uses sounds terrific, but how new first of all, is the technology that we have to extract that and then create new product? And if it's new, is it expensive?
Much of the technology isn't new, and certainly the chemistry isn't new or complicated. I think the question is around building the supply chains. So in forestry, for example, you have companies that harvest and replant and care for areas of land where they have tenure. They use the product for in sawmills or in pulp and paper companies. And then it's taking either waste or leftovers or tops and branches of trees that they can't use and finding a way to put those to use. The second challenge is in finding a way to dig out from the way that we dispose of waste, anything that's a wood-based or paper-based product, so that we can reuse it.
It's getting easier to understand that ROI now, right? Using the scraps to generate heat and power would amount to a significant cost-saving measure, and it's a no-brainer to be recycling wood products, whether that's lumber from a deconstruction site or paper products. But it's pretty cool to learn that wood product, like the fiber, that pulp, is used to make things like cosmetics, asphalt, clothing, even the interior appointments in your car.
You know, this is starting to sound like the forest life cycle conversation we had earlier in the series. The cycle of, planting, growing, nurturing, maintaining, harvesting, and then reseeding all over again. That becomes the backbone of that forest management plan we talked early on in the series. Now, when you look at the bioeconomy, it takes that life cycle even further because now we're extending the use of the wood product well beyond its first purpose.
Exactly. And in the last couple of episodes, we talked about that changing relationship with the forest, right? The changing relationship between governments and First Nations. And now we're really talking about an economic sector that's based on changing our relationship with wood and wood product. And that really comes down to using this product in, as we've said before, new and different ways.
So Monique says the federal and provincial governments gathered in this country in 2017 to pen the renewed forestry bioeconomy framework. And it was intended to actually create the guardrails and a map to advance Canada's bioeconomy.
The question for us really was, what can we do to accelerate the bioeconomy? So the bioeconomy in Canada is growing now about equivalent to the rest of the Canadian economy. But given the imperative to make sure that we're using everything that we harvest and using it those 3-4 times that we can, what do we need to do in order to accelerate and grow the bioeconomy more than we have before?
Considering that this framework was based on the meeting of the forest ministers across the country, do we do the same thing, or is there a conversation among that group of ministers and the agricultural ministers? Because clearly there's going to be overlap, and in some cases, best practices that we would learn from one another.
Oh, absolutely. So we have a very good relationship with our colleagues at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as with colleagues from Environment and Climate Change Canada who work on concepts like the circular economy.
Now, that framework had to be updated already in 2022, and it reflects the accelerated pace of growth. And the good news is the bioeconomy in Canada is clipping along, pretty good pace. The better news is apparently it can do better. Not to get too far down in the weeds, but there are some interesting numbers in this newest version of the framework. Canada's forest sector is the second largest exporter of forest products in the world. The bioeconomy as a whole is important to Canada. It comprises roughly 4% of Canada's GDP. The sector has kept pace with GDP growth over the last decade or so. But bioeconomies in other countries have grown significantly through their concerted investments all along bioeconomy value chains, extensive collaborations, efforts that included government, investors, industry, innovators, and certain bodies. Sweden, for example. The bioeconomy has, as a whole, is roughly about 10% of GDP, 13% of goods exports, and 9% national employment. In comparison, it's only 4% of GDP, 7% of goods exports, and 5% of national employment in Canada. So considering Canada's place as a forest product exporter and the sharpened focus by our governments to leverage the bioeconomy, there's plenty of reason to believe we'll see steady increase in its growth here in Canada.
Brings us right back to the imperative to make best use of every stick of wood. Doing that means value per cubic meter harvest will increase. That's a measurement, right? Basically, it means we're going to get a better return on investment on every tree because we're not wasting any of the wood.
What value per cubic meter harvested means is you get more money, more jobs, more revenue out of every tree that's taken out of the forest. When we count cubic meter, that means every part of the tree. So that would be all the bits that are going to 2x4s, all the bits that are going to paper, all the bits that might be residuals or waste wood. And it's making sure that we're getting the value for jobs and for the economy and for producing good, renewable, reusable products that we can possibly get. There's definitely room for us to grow there, and that's a key measure and metric for us. That also means at the end of the day, because part of this is about balancing the volume harvested with what's produced at the end. What we would aim for is, and what we've seen in the last number of years, is that provinces and territories have been either steady on what is allowed to be cut or it's been going down. But we want jobs and we want economic activity and we want the bioproducts for a net zero future that we're going to need. All of those renewable, reusable products. And the only way to balance all those objectives of maybe taking less and using it more, the only way to achieve that is to get more value out of what we take.
So right now, based on the details spelled out in the framework, Canada's value per cubic meter, just over $10 US. Look at Germany, Finland, Sweden, and the United States. Those rates are anywhere between $15 and $20. So the quicker we get to making best use of the wood product, the quicker that value is going to increase.
I'm sensing a couple things at play here when we start comparing the Canadian sector to others around the world.
I'm Mahima Sharma. I work as the Director of Environment, Innovation and Mill Regulations at the Forest Products Association of Canada.
Mahima Sharma is with the Forest Product Association of Canada, and her work is right at the center of the innovation we've been talking about. While Canada may be the second largest forest product exporter in the world, the timber we harvest in this country is less valuable than the timber harvested in countries like Finland and Sweden. They have less forest than we do in Canada, but they harvest significantly more than we do.
Our friends in Sweden and Finland, they have forests that are much smaller, but they harvest 6 to 8 times the timber volume per forest hectare than Canada does. But at the same time, Sweden's net annual increase in stored carbon in Swedish forests, it reduces their national GHG emissions by 70%.
Okay, that's worth repeating.
They harvest 6 to 8 times the timber volume per forest hectare than Canada does.
Even though they harvest more trees per forest hectare than we do here in Canada, Sweden's national GHG emissions go down.
it reduces their national GHG emissions by 70%.
That's a significant difference in approach between what we do here in Canada and what goes on in the Nordic countries.
They have worked very closely in the Nordic countries with industry partners to work with key industries like forestry to build sector-specific plans that help to maximize the environment and economic benefits.
Without getting off on a tangent, the Nordic forest management model provides some pretty interesting insights, if not best practices, that can inform how government, private sector, industry partners, researchers are all seeking to maximize the return on investment from the bioeconomy.
Yeah, we're going to explore some of those international practices in the next episode. In the meantime, though, it's important to note the Canadian forestry industry is not only producing product for the bioeconomy, it's using those very products to reduce its own carbon footprint. We already mentioned that saw and pulp mills are using the residual wood product to heat and power their operations.
Companies have made a lot of investments within their mills over the past now decade to help for fuel switching, for example. So within the mill processes, switching out fossil fuels to bio-based fuels. The forest product sector has been off of coal since 2011. And now we have also being able to install these cogeneration systems within our facilities, and we produce green electricity, which we can then sell to the grid. Now, this green electricity, over 80% of this green electricity is coming from wood-based residues, so wood fuel that's being used to generate this green electricity. So there's this continuous notion of improvement that we're seeing in our mills, and we have seen over the past decade. And I think we've come a very, very long way. We were early actors in GHG reduction in the mill environments.
And is that driven by the sector, i.e. the private sector, as opposed to, again, back to the government regulation and standards?
It's driven by both, right? The technology has to be, of course, is coming from the private sector. And of course, there's market pull measures to help facilitate the uptake. But we've also seen government investment as well, which has been critical to make this possible in Canada at such a large scale. We have about almost 40 facilities in Canada that are producing green electricity. And this has been largely in part due to incentives from the federal government. At the time, there was this program called the Pulp and Paper Green Transformation Program that has been very supportive in helping the sector achieve this.
Some of that green power is also being sold back to the electrical grid. Mahima says it's a great example of how the market and governments incentivize this type of innovation. And Monique, well, she'll tell you there are several investment programs that promote the research and development for that kind of technology.
The Investments in Forest Industry Transformation Program and its partner, the Forest Innovation Program, have been around for several years. And between those two programs, we are able to fund from the very beginning of scientific research on how to use wood fiber and the components of wood fiber and their different properties, through to the development of new products and the commercialization of those products, which means that we're able to connect all of those dots. It's led to some real successes, including, for example, emerging work on nanocrystals, some innovative building products that are used in mass timber buildings, and we really see that benefit of the federal government being able to build on successive investments with industry who is also able to kick in some of the funding for those things. Any of the activities that we do include a very significant portion of private sector funding coming from the industry who's participating in those projects and those investments. That also makes it really worthwhile, because then we know that there are private sector entities who are willing to put some skin in the game.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's always the case, right? I mean, as soon as we can get they can see that they're willing to write a check when they can get a check back, basically.
Exactly. Yes.
All this sounds great, but let me take a hot minute and play devil's advocate here. This is all about new use, new tech, new products. Let me put my business strategy hat on and point out the only way for this to be successful or for the bioeconomy to grow is then to have a new market for all of this product. We need capacity in the industry if we're going to scale this up to a point where it represents a higher percentage of GDP.
Okay, and I put that to Monique, capacity and scale.
It speaks to scale, it speaks to demand, it speaks to the price that someone is willing to pay for those residuals. It speaks to the cost of the transportation of those residuals from wherever they are to wherever they would be used. All of those issues are ones that we need to work on a little bit more. You'll see some references to some of those issues in the renewed bioeconomy framework. And certainly for us, we're very seized with working with industry and with investors, with the private sector, with researchers to try to crack some of those problems or some of those challenges.
So it is, again, when you describe it that way, it sounds like almost a very local benefit for some of these products. Is there any view that we get beyond that sort of network of local benefits as opposed to scaling these things up so that whatever fuel that they're producing in Quebec is available to me in Manitoba?
Yes, and that's exactly why you see an emphasis on biomass availability mapping, which sounds like nobody but a government could have made that up. But that's why we talk about biomass availability in the renewed framework, because for anyone who's going to invest in a plant that would have a scale for the entirety of the Canadian market or for export markets, they are going to need a certain volume of input. And that's where they need to know how much biomass is going to be available in that particular place and how regularly and how much can I rely on that input, that volume, and how much is it going to cost.
Kind of starting to sound like we're building the plane while we're flying it, right? And I don't mean that as a negative by any means. It harkens back to Laird Van Dam's observations in episode 7. Our relationship with the forest is actually rapidly changing, primarily because of the rapid advancement of climate change. So the science supporting these modern forest management plans is advancing more quickly than ever.
Yeah, similarly, the growth goals for the bioeconomy rely on a similar posture, right? A similar rate of acceleration. So that petri dish of investment, of innovation, research, and development is producing things like these biofuels that produce green energy.
So keeping with that train of thought, the trajectory of the bioeconomy will really take off when the ROI creeps into consumer consciousness.
The idea of doing all of this can always seem to be righteous and virtuous and so on, and we're on the right side of the angels here because we want to make sure the environment is good. The fact is, no business does something that is contrary to good business. So at some point, somebody didn't just say this is good for the environment. This had to be good for business, for the forestry sector to embrace this in such a way. With innovative technology, because that costs money, retooling your technology, that costs money. So there must be a demonstration of some kind of significant ROI for the forest industry to be taking this path. The bottom line is still the bottom line.
For companies to be successful, demonstrating good environmental performance is mandatory, right? That's something that people want to see when purchasing their products. You want to know that you're purchasing your products from a company or from a sector and an industry with a good environmental reputation. When I go to the store and I'm making my purchases, I always look for where are these products made in, and is this, is this product biodegradable or recyclable? Like, these are decisions now that we see many consumers are now taking when they're purchasing their products. So, as we're moving now more towards this, I would say a bio-based economy, these are decisions that people are keeping in mind and should be keeping in mind so that they are supporting sustainable Canadian practices and industries.
So let's take the next step then. And I agree with you that, in fact, I think there's more consciousness around that. The idea, though, that if I'm going to go out and buy, a new kitchen table that's wood product, is it always well labeled, or am I always obviously aware that, this was made in Ontario, or this was made in British Columbia, or this is from forests that were harvested in New Brunswick? Are we good at that?
The ones that I have seen in my own experience from going shopping, it'll say made in Quebec, made in Canada. And for me personally, these are very important decisions I make when I'm shopping. But I think that there is a lot more work that can be done to improve the labeling and to improve the labeling process, letting consumers know where this has come from. And also, it's almost like a nutrition label, right? That you could put on a finished product that shows this is how much carbon is being stored in this wooden table that you're purchasing. So I think there's a lot more work that Canada can do to improve that. And it's that communication that helps, and I would say resonates with the consumer.
I love that idea, the labeling of wood products. So we not only know whether it's, homegrown lumber from Quebec or Ontario, but almost like, the ingredients you find on a food product. This, say, 8-foot long piece of 2x4 contains this much carbon. And if you did that, it changes the whole perspective on the value of carbon.
Well, yeah, of course. It's a perfect way to close the loop on that initial question we asked about the cost of fighting climate change. Rather than making the price tag, the fear, or the how are we going to afford this paralyze the whole conversation, frame it in words that matter, not only to the industry, to the government, researchers, investors. That whole labeling idea would be a pretty clever way to raise awareness of the value of carbon and how we can actually benefit from the ROI of the bioeconomy as consumers.
Yeah. So we're going to continue this bioeconomy conversation in the next episode. There's some really cool tech helping us transition from the fossil fuel economy to a green, climate-friendly economy. It's a game changer if we can follow this.
We're also going to get some cool perspective on the bioeconomies in both Europe and in New Zealand.
So if you've got some thought about the program, leave us a comment wherever you're listening to the show.
And with that, leave a rating if you're listening on Apple, because that makes it way easier for others to find our show.
For Aaron, our producer Becky Coles, and for the rest of the Story Studio Network team, thanks for joining us. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.